He inherited a kingdom, but what haunted him was the silence between temple bells. The air was still, thick with the scent of sandalwood and ash. From the highest stupa of Wat Mahathat, the city of Sukhothai looked like a dream frozen in gold and mist. Dawn crept in quietly, brushing its pale fingers across the cracked bricks and the outstretched palms of ancient Buddhas. Beneath the bell tower, a young man stood in ceremonial silence. His robe too heavy, his crown too tight. He was now king, but he felt more like a witness. A stranger to a throne left warm by a father whose presence still clung to every wall, every corridor of the palace, every heartbeat of the capital. Lotai was only 30, but the lines under his eyes bore the weight of a dynasty just beginning to find its voice. He had grown up surrounded by stories of greatness, how his father, Inthrathit, had thrown off the Khmer yoke and carved out a kingdom not with overwhelming armies but with unbreakable vision. Yet, as the funeral pyre of the founder smoldered behind him, Lotai found himself not inspired, but hollow. The sound of morning chants echoed through the city, yet all he heard was a question he could not answer. What comes after the founder? The transition had been swift, almost too smooth. No wars, no assassination attempts, just a gathering of nobles and monks beneath the Bodhi trees, confirming the eldest son as the next bearer of the white umbrella. Yet the silence of resistance unnerved him more than rebellion. Behind the bowing heads and polished smiles, Lotai sensed currents, unseen, swirling beneath the surface like the Chao Phraya beneath floodwaters. His younger brother, Ban Muing, stood by his side, loyal in public but unreadable in private. Courtiers who had sworn allegiance to his father now offered prayers with eyes too still. And the elder monks, they said all the right words but avoided his gaze. It was as if the entire kingdom had entered a pause, an inhale before an uncertain exhale. He remembered the last night he saw his father alive. Inthrathit had summoned him not to a war council, but to a small chamber filled with incense and old scriptures. There, the old king had handed him a single palm leaf manuscript, worn, brittle, sacred. It was not a treaty, nor a royal order. It was a verse from the Dhammapada, "Master yourself, then you will master others." That was the last thing the old lion said before retreating into meditation. The next morning, he was gone. Lotai carried that verse with him, not just in memory but in struggle. He had been raised in the palace, trained in calligraphy and statecraft, fluent in Sanskrit and Pali, but not war-tested. Unlike his father, he had not fought on elephant back or ridden with scouts into the forest to rally hill tribes. His battlefield was quieter, negotiation rooms, temple libraries, sleepless nights of questioning what kind of king he was meant to be. His power came not from bloodshed but from thought. And now, on the brink of a reign that would either define or dissolve his father's legacy, he found himself haunted not by enemies, but by silence. The people of Sukhothai were still rejoicing in ritual. Offerings poured into the temples. Monks chanted day and night. The royal astrologers proclaimed the omens favorable. 3 lotus buds had bloomed in the river. A white deer had appeared near the city gates. But Lotai felt none of the joy. Instead, he sat alone at night in the old scriptorium, surrounded by scrolls and statues, staring into candlelight as if the flames might whisper advice. He had inherited a kingdom still under construction, physically, culturally, spiritually. The capital was beautiful, yes, but small. The borders were fluid, the roads dusty, the nobles semi-autonomous. Khmer influence lingered in the language, in the stone carvings, in the rituals. The people spoke a crude dialect of Thai, but all formal documents were still written in Khmer or Pali. Even the temples bore the curves of Angkor, not the elegance of a native style. What did it mean, Lotai wondered, to rule a kingdom still searching for its soul? And so he began with what he knew: words. Not commands, but verses. He surrounded himself with monks, not just for counsel, but for conversation. But in private, it was more than that. It was a confession. A man not yet ready for kingship trying to make sense of the cosmic map of karma and power. His working title was Tre Phum, the three worlds. But philosophy could not wait for political stability. Already, word came from the western hills. A chieftain had refused to pay tribute. Rumors spread of Khmer agents stirring rebellion in the south. Some nobles whispered that Lothai was too soft, too obsessed with temples, too detached from politics. Others said he was too clever, too quiet, hiding ambitions no one yet understood. In the east, emissaries from Lana arrived with gifts and riddles, testing the new king's resolve. Every choice he made now would echo for generations. And yet, he hesitated. On the third night after his coronation, he walked barefoot to Wat Sa Si, the small island temple his father had loved. There, surrounded by moonlit water and flickering lamps, he sat cross-legged before a massive Buddha image. He did not pray. He did not chant. He simply listened. And in that stillness, a thought came, not as lightning, but as mist. Power is not the opposite of fear. It is its vessel. And only through understanding fear, its shape, the silence, can one wield power without becoming its slave. He returned to the palace before sunrise. The guards were startled, but he waved them off. In his private chamber, he took off the crown and placed it on a plain wooden shelf. Then he wrote a single sentence in his journal. "Today, I begin not to rule, but to understand what ruling means." Outside, the bells of the morning prayer began to ring. But within him, there was still silence. A silence he now embraced, not as weakness, but as the space where wisdom begins. Little did he know, the true test of his reign was already taking shape, in shadows cast not by enemies abroad, but by those closest to him. The smoke from the funeral pyre drifted slowly toward the mountains, curling skyward like the memory of a voice that would never return. The people of Sukhothai had lined the temple roads for hours, holding candles and lotus blossoms, heads bowed in reverence. See Inthrathit, the father of the kingdom, had been laid to rest with chants that echoed across the water. But energetically, the courtiers, so loyal to see Inthrathit, moved with subtle changes in tone. Some bowed too deeply, others not at all. The silences in the great hall grew longer. The noble houses began to move pieces across an invisible board. The house of Muing Nakhon, led by a cousin on his mother's side, but he understood one thing clearly. The respect his father commanded by Shir will had to be earned again by a very different king. That realization came sharply during the final rite of the funeral. As the court stood in silence before the towering pyre, a monk stepped forward to give the last sermon. He was not the abbot of Wat Mahathat. He was not even a royal appointee. He was a forest monk. The air turned colder as the monk's voice faded. Lothai stood still, his face unreadable. But inside, something shifted. Was it a rebuke? Was it a warning? Or was it a challenge? That night, he requested the monk be brought to the palace. But the monk had vanished, leaving behind only the scent of incense and a single phrase carved into a plank near the temple wall. A crown is heaviest when it is silent. Lothai returned to his chambers and found himself unable to sleep. His dreams were crowded. His father's face appearing and dissolving in clouds of smoke. His brother's voice echoing with words not yet spoken. His own hands reaching for something intangible. Dawn came, but he did not rise. Instead, he lay awake, replaying every glance from the funeral, every bowed head, every sideways look. It was during this sleeplessness that he realized the legacy he had inherited was not only one of borders and temples, it was one of expectations. His father had carved a path through the wilderness. Now Lothai was expected to pave it into permanence. But how do you make permanent what was born in rebellion? How do you solidify a kingdom built on spirit, not structure? He turned to the one thing he trusted, the written word. In the weeks following the funeral, Lothai spent his evenings in the library, but to compare, to understand where the paths diverged, where wisdom decayed into dogma. He asked for scribes to begin copying new scrolls in the Thai vernacular, an act that quietly challenged the elite's grip on language. One scribe hesitated and warned him, Some will not like this, my lord. They fear the people will begin to read as kings do. Lotai only nodded. That was precisely the point. Outside the palace, a different kind of current began to flow. The nobility noticed the shift. Temple schools reported increased demand for Thai script. Young monks asked to be taught not only the Vinaya but also how to inscribe it in their native tongue. The aristocracy, once dismissive of common language, began to murmur. What began as quiet reform was now perceived as subtle revolution. Meanwhile, the court grew colder. One evening, Lotai received word that a senior counselor, a man who had once served C. Inthrithit faithfully, had died mysteriously in his sleep. A week later, another nobleman from the western borderlands disappeared on his return from the capital. Whispers of poison, betrayal, and secret councils began to curl like smoke through the corridors. At the center of this storm, Ban Muing grew bolder. He began hosting private banquets in his villa outside the city walls, inviting nobles, commanders, and discontented scholars. He commissioned a statue of the founder, his father, but with ambiguous features. When confronted, he claimed it was a tribute. But the sculpture's gaze bore not the firmness of C. Inthrithit, but the ambition of someone who saw the throne as unfinished business. Lotai watched, listened, waited. He did not strike. Instead, he summoned an elder monk from Levo, a region known for its spiritual lineage. The monk arrived barefoot, bearing no gifts, only questions. Over 3 days, they spoke in a hidden chamber of the palace, discussing karma, legacy, and the nature of rightful rule. On the final day, the monk told him, "The body of a kingdom is built by hands, but its breath comes from the soul of the ruler. If your soul is not at peace, neither will be your land." That night, Lotai sat beneath a Bodhi tree planted by his father years ago. The leaves rustled in the warm breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a drumbeat echoed, a festival or a warning. He touched the soil, remembering his father's final gift, the verse from the Dhammapada. "Master yourself, then you will master others." The ashes of the founder were now entombed, but his shadow remained. And Lotai, the silent prince turned solemn king, was beginning to understand that his greatest battle would not be against armies, but against memory. The kingdom sang in a tongue that was not its own. In the stone reliefs of the temples, the inscriptions spoke in Khmer. In the scrolls housed in the royal archives, Pali dictated doctrine, law, and lineage. Even in the soft chanting of monks beneath the Bodhi trees, the cadence carried the tones of distant empires. Lotai, as king, signed edicts in languages alien to the farmers who fed his people, the soldiers who defended his borders, and the children who played in the courtyards of Sukhothai's temples. His own people bowed to a tongue they could not read, prayed in verses they barely understood, and governed with ideas filtered through foreign symbols. And that, Lotai decided, had to change. It began not with a decree, but with a question: what is a kingdom, if its voice is borrowed? He asked it of his court scribes. Some shrugged. Others fumbled for political answers. One, an elderly man with eyes dulled by years of careful copying, dared to whisper, "A kingdom without its own language is not yet awake." Lotai took that whisper and turned it into a quiet fire. He began by visiting the script masters who carved temple stones. These were men of calloused hands and bowed backs, artisans who understood the rhythm of letters, even if they had never ruled a province. He asked them to show him how they would carve a name, not in Khmer, not in Pali, but in the speech of the people. They hesitated. It had never been done. Not for royalty, but he insisted. The first word they carved was his name, Lotai, not in the language of gods or priests, but in Thai, raw, angular, breathing. He stared at it for a long time, tracing the grooves with his fingers. It felt like meeting himself for the first time. Soon after, he ordered all official correspondence within the palace to be translated into the local script. Then, he commissioned scholars to begin compiling a Thai lexicon, a dictionary of sorts, pairing words with meaning, symbols with sound. He funded the transcription of Buddhist texts into Thai, not to replace Pali, but to place the sacred within reach of every devotee. And he commanded that temple sermons, previously intoned in high language few villagers comprehended, be spoken in Thai once a week, so that even the farmer and the potter might understand the path to liberation. To the monks and the people it was revelation. To the nobles and Khmer loyalists, it was rebellion. Letters poured in from the outer provinces. Some praised the king's vision. Others warned him to tread carefully. One anonymous missive, written in flawless Sanskrit, accused him of cultural betrayal, stating, "You desecrate the sacred by dressing it in the rags of peasants." Lotai smiled when he read it. Then he had it copied word for word and inscribed beneath a Thai translation, placing both on opposite walls of the palace scriptorium, like a mirror. Let the people see both tongues. Let them decide which reflected their truth. But the reaction from the court was not so philosophical. The elite, those educated in the traditions of Angkor and Ayutthaya, saw the king's efforts not as enlightenment but as erosion. The sanctity of old language, they claimed, kept chaos at bay. To unweave it was to undo order itself. Behind closed doors, they began holding council, nobles, old monks, foreign envoys. Their fear was not merely about words. It was about power. Language was the gatekeeper of law, religion, history. If the common people learned to read what only the elite once understood, the walls would fall. And in the middle of this growing tension stood Ban Muing. He had remained quiet for weeks, watchful, composed, calculating. But now he moved. He began hosting poetry gatherings in Khmer, inviting courtiers and monks loyal to the old ways. He patronized temples that refused to adopt Thai script. He financed scholars who criticized the king's reforms under the guise of preserving tradition. And in one carefully choreographed festival, he gifted the temple a golden manuscript written in Pali, but left an empty space where the king's name would have been inscribed. A blank spot, a silent protest. Lotai did not respond. Instead, he visited the schools. He walked barefoot into village monasteries, sitting among children as they traced Thai letters onto palm leaves. He listened as novice monks stuttered through local chants. He smiled when a farmer's son recited a teaching of the Buddha in the dialect of his own mother. These moments, small and unrecorded, became the pillars of his resolve. But his silence only emboldened his enemies. One morning, a messenger arrived from the western province of Kamphaeng Phet. The provincial governor, a cousin to Lotai's mother, had declared that from now on, his region would issue decrees in Khmer only, as a matter of spiritual continuity. The message was sealed with a black ribbon, an old sign of political warning. It was not yet rebellion, but it was close. The court was split. Some urged Lotai to send an army. Others demanded a public condemnation. Even Chanthada, ever wise, whispered that appeasement might be seen as weakness. But Lotai chose a different path. He wrote a letter, not in Khmer, not in Pali, in Thai, and not to the governor, but to the people of Kamphaeng Phet. He described the glory of their land, the strength of their ancestors, the rice fields that fed the nation. He wrote of their beauty, their voice, their soul, and asked why a people so noble should live through words not their own. The letter was copied, recited in temples, and sung in market squares. It did not demand. It invited. Within a month, the province returned to silence. But in that silence, something shifted. The nobles did not speak openly, but their eyes grew colder. Lotai had bypassed them, spoken directly to the people. And in doing so, he had broken the unwritten code of elite rule. Yet he did not stop. He ordered the great stone archway at the entrance to Sukhothai to be reinscribed, not erasing the old, but layering the new. Beneath the Khmer carvings, Thai script now welcomed travelers to the city of wisdom. The capital was becoming bilingual, not just in form, but in spirit. Lotai stood before the arch one evening, the scent of jasmine in the air, the sky painted with the last orange strokes of sunset. He read the new lines aloud, his voice soft but steady. A small group of children nearby looked up, curious. One of them asked him, What does that mean? He knelt beside the boy, pointed to the words, and replied, "It means this land belongs not to the past, but to those who speak its truth." And for the first time in months, he heard something deeper than chants or drums. He heard understanding. But as his reforms took root, so too did resentment. Somewhere in the shadows of the palace, a group of nobles gathered. A candle was lit, plan was whispered, a message sent. Sukhothai had given his people a voice. Now someone would try to take his breath away. The moon hung low over Sukhothai like a blade yet to fall. In the quiet corridors of the royal palace, oil lamps flickered against walls adorned with lotus patterns and sacred geometry. But behind those walls, beneath layers of incense and formality, something ancient and primal stirred. Something that had waited in silence, like a wound that never fully closed. The throne was warm, but so was the resentment. The kingdom had found its voice. Now it began to tremble under its own echo. Ban Muing stood beneath a banyan tree in his private villa just outside the capital. He wore no crown, carried no sword, spoke no threat, but power radiated from him like heat from coals. Around him were men of lineage and loyalty, nobles whose families had once ruled in the name of Angkor, monks with hardened eyes, merchants whose coin had built half the city. They drank spiced wine, spoke in careful tones, and never once mentioned rebellion. But it hovered in the air like smoke. The younger brother of the king had always been different. Calmer, colder, unreadable. Where Sukhothai sought meaning in scrolls and sermons, Ban Muing studied people. He knew when to flatter, when to wait, when to pull back and let hunger do the work. He was not cruel. He was precise. And he knew something that most forgot. The people may love a philosopher-king, but they follow those who promise certainty. Sukhothai had begun to alter the foundation, language, liturgy, education. And in doing so, he had opened cracks. Not in the kingdom, in the men who feared change. The night the archway was reinscribed, Ban Muing said nothing. He simply visited Wat the Fang, a temple built by their grandfather, and sat in meditation for hours. When he emerged, he summoned a sculptor. 2 days later, a new statue was unveiled in the western court. A seated figure, half shrouded in royal robes, half in monastic drapery. The inscription beneath read, "Power rests not in the word, but in the silence before it." The city whispered. Some praised the artistry. Others saw the message. The statue's face looked suspiciously like Ban Muing. Sukhothai did not respond. Instead, he turned inward. He held long sessions with his advisors, those few who had remained loyal through reform. He invited young monks from the provinces to the palace, listened to their stories, their dialects, their fears. He began drafting a series of policies aimed at decentralizing authority, allowing local temples to become centers not only of worship, but of community governance. A quiet revolution, written in the language of compassion. But every act of faith triggered an equal force of resistance. The nobles of Phitsanulok began to withhold donations to temples that supported the new script. A series of fires erupted in rice warehouses along the southern trade road, none fatal, all symbolic. A senior scribe was found drowned in the palace moat, his fingers broken, his tongue removed. The guards claimed he fell during a seizure, but everyone knew better. Then came the incident at Wat Mahathat. It was the first full moon of the planting season. Monks and villagers had gathered in celebration. Lanterns lit the sky. Prayers were sung in Thai. But just as the final chants rose into the night, a commotion erupted. A group of masked men, swift and silent, stormed the central hall. They carried no blades, only torches. Within minutes, part of the prayer pavilion was engulfed in flames. The attackers vanished. No one was killed, but the message was clear. Fire speaks louder than words. Sukhothai arrived before dawn. He walked barefoot through the charred ruins, his royal retinue trailing behind like ghosts. Ash clung to his robe. He picked up a piece of scorched wood, still warm. The blackened remains of prayer scrolls crumbled beneath his fingers. He said nothing, But that night he summoned Ban Muing. It was the first time the two brothers had spoken alone in over a year. What passed between them is not recorded. No scribe was present. No guard was allowed near. It was short, written in Thai, and carved into temple stones across the kingdom. It read, "Let those who burn prayer speak their truth in daylight. Let those who fear words confront them with wisdom. This kingdom is not built on silence, but on understanding. But understanding is a fragile scaffold." In the following weeks, Sukhothai's reform reached its tipping point. Of a crown that melted into water, then reformed in the hands of a faceless man. One evening, while walking the palace grounds, he stopped beneath the same banyan tree where his father had once declared Sukhothai's independence. The air was heavy. A storm was building. He turned to Chanthada. Her eyes were calm, but her hands trembled. "You've given them the truth," she whispered. "Now they will test if you believe it enough to bleed for it." Sukhothai looked up at the night sky, where clouds churned like old gods waking. "Then let them come," he said. But in his heart, he knew the real enemy was not his brother, nor the nobles, nor even the fire. It was doubt, and it had already entered the kingdom. He began writing it as a prayer. Then it became a warning, and finally, a confession. By the time the monsoon season rolled across Sukhothai, Sukhothai had withdrawn from public appearances. Rumors abounded that he had fallen ill, that he was building a secret army, that he had taken a vow of silence. But none of them were true. The king was neither broken nor plotting. He was writing. In a dimly lit chamber behind the royal library, surrounded by scrolls older than his kingdom and candlelight flickering like restless spirits, Sukhothai worked by hand. No scribe was allowed entry. No advisors were consulted. Only he and the sound of rain against stone. The words flowed from him not like water, but like blood, slow, painful, and sacred. The manuscript would eventually be called Tre Phum Phra Ruang, the Three Worlds of King Ruang. But to Sukhothai, it was simply the mirror, because every word he wrote reflected what he feared most. Himself. He structured it around cosmology, not to explain the heavens, but to untangle the suffering on earth. The hell realms, the animal realms, the human world, the gods and the titans, it was all there. But woven into the mythos was something deeper, a question pulsing between the lines like a heartbeat. If karma governs the soul, what governs the king? Sukhothai had studied all the texts. He knew the laws of samsara, the weight of intention, the chains of desire. But now, at the height of his power, he felt those laws wrap around him like an invisible net. Every decision he made stirred ripples he could not predict. Every reform gave birth to resentment. Every word he spoke was twisted by those who feared its meaning. He no longer trusted his voice, so he let the manuscript speak. In the chapter on the realms of hungry ghosts, he described rulers who fed on flattery and left their people starving. In the realm of animals, he wrote of nobles who obeyed out of instinct, not insight. In the realm of gods, he warned of monks who sought heaven but forgot compassion. And in the human realm, he carved a parable of a king who could not sleep because the ghosts of his decisions stood at the foot of his bed each night. He did not name names, but everyone in the palace felt seen. As word of the manuscript's existence spread, pressure mounted. The court demanded to read it. The monks begged for early copies. Foreign emissaries asked if it would be translated. Sukhothai refused them all. "It is not yet ready," he said. But the truth was simpler. It was not yet safe. Because in between the allegories and celestial hierarchies, Sukhothai had embedded his greatest heresy, one no kingdom had dared utter. A ruler who does not master his own suffering will only spread it. It was an indictment, not just of past kings, of himself. He had begun to see it in his own reflection. The weight loss, the furrowed brow, the sleeplessness, the inability to smile without calculation. The moments of anger, sudden and uncharacteristic, when he snapped at Chanthada or the servants for no reason. The cold that seeped into his bones during meditation. The phantom aches in his joints when he passed the charred ruins of what Mahathat. Sukhothai was evolving. The language reforms had taken root. Villages were forming councils under the guidance of local monks. Young men were quoting his words in market debates. But peace was not following progress. It was fracturing under it. And in that fracture, doubt grew. The manuscript became his anchor, his temple, his battlefield. But even within the palace, dangers thickened. Late one evening, while copying a passage on the karma of false speech, Sukhothai collapsed at his desk. His servants found him hours later, fevered, hallucinating, his lips moving in half-formed verses. The court physicians were summoned. Herbs were boiled. Prayers were chanted. Some claimed it was exhaustion. Others whispered poison. Chanthada did not leave his side. For 4 days, the king drifted in and out of consciousness. And in that liminal space between breath and dream, he saw visions that would shape the rest of his reign. He saw a throne made of sand, crumbling with every vow spoken too quickly. He saw a temple floating in the sky, filled with statues whose mouths were open but whose eyes wept. He saw Ban Muing standing in a field of fire, offering him a crown made of ash. And he saw himself alone, in a chamber of mirrors that reflected not his face, but the faces of his people, each one twisted by suffering he could not soothe. When he awoke, the fever had broken, but something in him had fractured. He asked for the manuscript. His hands trembled as he read the last passage he had written. Then, in silence, he picked up his brush and added 5 words. Even Dharma can be corrupted. That line would later be struck from all published copies of Trefum. But Chanthada remembered it, and she would never forget the look in his eyes when he wrote it. Not fear, not defiance, but clarity. Sukhothai rose from his bed the next day and walked unassisted to the courtyard. The sky was still heavy with rain clouds, but a shaft of light broke through and struck the stone beneath his feet. He looked at Chanthada and said, "It is time." "Time for what?" she asked. "To stop hiding in truth," he answered, "and face the lies that wear robes." Within the week, he summoned the abbots of the 5 largest monasteries, not to offer favor but to interrogate them. He questioned their use of royal funds, the fidelity of their teachings, their loyalty to the kingdom over sect. One abbot refused to appear. He was found the next morning at the base of the river cliff. The kingdom held its breath. Sukhothai ordered that his manuscript be copied, not in one place but 10, then 20, 50. He dispatched them to every corner of Sukhothai, to temples, to schools, to remote hermits in the forest. "Let it be read," he said, "even the parts they will wish to forget." And just like that, Trefum stopped being a scroll. It became scripture, but it also became a target. Because no kingdom survives long when its king teaches his people to question the heavens. And somewhere, in the shadows of the palace, the knives began to sharpen again. The king had dared to question not only kingship but Dharma itself. He had dared to suggest that monks, men once thought beyond reproach, could be instruments of ego, that the robe did not sanctify the soul. In kingdoms ruled by lineage, this would be blasphemy. But in Sukhothai, it was war. The Buddhist clergy had long been pillars of the realm, spiritually revered, socially embedded, politically immune. They blessed every coronation, mediated border disputes, counseled kings, and kept the moral compass of the state aligned with doctrine. But they were also gatekeepers of literacy, of legitimacy, of power cloaked in virtue. Sukhothai had not set out to burn that gate. He simply lit a lantern too close. In temples across the kingdom, the ripple of Trefum divided communities. Young monks hailed it as a revelation, a return to true teaching, a stripping away of ritual excess. They began holding open dialogues in Thai, questioning the wealth of their own abbots, refusing to accept donations from nobles with corrupt reputations. The older monks did not share their enthusiasm. In private, they called Sukhothai a philosopher possessed by self-doubt. They said he mistook introspection for insight, mistook karma for law, and mistook his own restlessness for the suffering of the nation. They whispered that the king had strayed from the middle path, that he had become too Brahmin to be Buddhist, too questioning to be king. And in that fertile soil of critique grew conspiracy. The first blow did not fall on Lotai himself. It fell on his reforms. In a sudden turn, the council of elder monks, comprised of the most senior religious figures in the kingdom, issued a declaration. No teaching of Dharma shall be considered canon unless ratified by the Sangha. On the surface, it was procedure. In reality, it was a direct strike against Tre Phum, a call to silence it, or worse, reinterpret it. Lotai did not answer with anger. He answered with fire. In a public ceremony held at Wat Sa Si, attended by hundreds of villagers and foreign emissaries, he stood before a marble slab engraved with the Sangha's decree, and beside it, he unveiled a new inscription, his own. 5 lines only, carved in Thai. Truth does not wait for permission. The Dharma is not owned. Scripture is not shield. Compassion is not currency. And robes are not proof. The crowd fell silent. Then came the murmur. Then came the shift. The inscription became a lightning rod. Within days, temples loyal to the old order began restricting access to education. Monks loyal to Lotai were exiled from key monasteries. In the eastern region of Si Sachinalai, a fire broke out in a temple known for teaching Tre Phum. No lives lost, no culprits caught, only smoke and silence. Chanthada warned him, "You've torn the veil, my love, but behind it is a mirror, and in it they do not see themselves. They see a threat." But Lotai pressed forward. He reached beyond his kingdom. He sent envoys to Sri Lanka, where Theravada Buddhism had its purest roots. He invited monks from Lana, Lonsang, and even pagan regions with their own variations of faith, less entangled with courtly power. He wanted perspectives. He wanted contradiction. He wanted to remind his kingdom that the Dharma was not a fortress, but a path, winding and open to all who walked it with sincerity. This terrified the old order more than anything, because to them, contradiction was chaos. The backlash came through ritual. In one of Sukhothai's oldest temples, a mass chanting was held, led by monks who had once crowned his father. Their voices, rhythmic and unwavering, repeated a verse long buried in obscure doctrine. "A kingdom that separates monk from monarch shall fall as the moon from the sky." It was a curse, cloaked in liturgy, delivered in front of the royal palace. The king watched from his balcony. He did not interrupt. He simply listened. Then he did something no king had done before. He stepped down from the balcony and walked alone, barefoot, into the chanting. The monks hesitated. He bowed before them, not in surrender, but in sorrow. And he said quietly but clearly, "Then may the moon fall, if it lights the way." Not all monks bowed in return. Some turned their backs. Others followed him. That week, a schism began. Not civil war, not bloodshed, but something deeper. 2 visions of faith, 2 paths toward truth. 2 Sukhothais, one rooted in the past, one reaching toward something unformed. In the midst of this, a monk arrived from Sri Lanka, a man known for his wisdom and austerity. He carried no possessions, wore no ornament, spoke in measured cadence. His name was Ananda Jaya. He had heard of Lotai's reforms. He had read fragments of Tre Phum, and he had come not to teach, but to listen. He stayed for weeks in the forest temple near the capital. Lotai visited him each night. They spoke of power, impermanence, guilt, and grace. One night, Ananda asked him, "Why do you fear them?" Lotai replied, "Because I've made them see what they forgot, and they hate the mirror more than the flame." Ananda said nothing, but the next morning, he left behind a single line etched into the dirt outside his hut. "Let those who fear light become blind. The seer must still open his eyes." By then, the Sangha had grown restless, and so they took a final step. A secret council convened, its purpose unclear. But soon after, whispers began of an advisory vote to request the king relinquish all say in monastic appointments. a polite exile from religious influence, the separation of throne and robe. Lotai heard the news not with rage, but with grief. He returned to his writing chamber. He took a brush, and beneath the final page of Treifeng, he added, "If the robe becomes the crown, and the crown seeks the robe, then neither shall guide. Only the walking stick of truth remains, and that, too, breaks." It was not defeat, it was clarity, but clarity like flame casts shadows. And in those shadows, the next betrayal was already waiting. Not from the monks, not from the nobles, but from within the one place he had left undefended, his own household. She had always been there, in the background, in the shadow just behind his voice, in the silence between his words. Chanthada was never crowned with gold. Her crown was restraint. From the day Lotai ascended the throne, she had walked beside him. Not behind, not before, but precisely beside. Not as an ornament, not as a consort, but as a witness. And witnesses, she knew, carried the heaviest burden of all, to see clearly and say nothing. She had watched him shape a kingdom with scrolls, not spears. Watched him lose sleep over the weight of syllables. Watched him question not just the nature of power, but the soul of his own reign. She admired him, she feared for him, and slowly she feared him. Because with each act of reform, Lotai stepped further from the man she had married, and closer to something sacred, unreachable, and unbearably alone. At first, her role had been quiet, advising on temple alliances, overseeing the women's quarters, calming nervous nobles during periods of transition. She had a gift for diplomacy, the kind that never appeared in official records but kept court politics from cracking at the seams. When Lotai retreated into writing Treifeng, it was Chanthada who ensured rice reached the northern provinces. When he summoned foreign monks, it was she who hosted the feasts and remembered which envoy's daughter feared dogs. Her touch was invisible, her presence inescapable. But as Lotai turned inward, the court turned to her. They came not with threats, not with bribes, but with questions delivered through sighs, glances, and coded prayers. Has the king eaten? Does he sleep through the night? Does he still speak with you? At first she deflected, then she delayed, then she listened, because even Chanthada, for all her loyalty, had begun to wonder if the man she loved had become a prisoner of his own virtue. The breaking point came in the year of the rainless rains. They did not ask her to betray him, they asked her to guide him. "Speak to him," said the High Abbot of Phitsanulok. "Bring him back to us, before the kingdom withers with the fields." She agreed, not out of disloyalty, but out of fear. That night she entered his chamber, the one lined with scrolls and maps and half-finished verses. He was writing by candlelight, eyes sunken, fingers ink-stained. She stood in the doorway for a long time before speaking. "You've made the temples your battlefield," she said softly. He didn't look up. "They made it so," he replied. She crossed the room slowly, as if approaching a cliff edge. "They say the rain has stopped because the land is no longer at peace. They say many things," he whispered. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then what do you say?" He finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was not anger, not fatigue, but something far worse: isolation. "I say the rain is a teacher, and we have not yet learned." She withdrew her hand. In that moment, something broke between them, not loudly, not violently, but with the quiet inevitability of two rivers diverging after a long journey together. In the following days, Chanthada began to make decisions without him. She reopened trade routes to old temple-aligned provinces, reinstated certain ritual privileges Lotai had suspended, sent private envoys to Ban Muing not to conspire, but to inquire. "Where do you stand?" she asked. "With the kingdom, or against your brother?" Ban Muing did not answer in words. He sent a gift, a jade carving of a Bodhi leaf, cracked down the center. The message was clear. The split was complete. Meanwhile, Lotai remained consumed with Tre Phum's proliferation. He had begun composing a supplementary commentary, clarifying controversial passages. He still believed in the path, still believed that if he could just explain it clearly enough, the resistance would dissolve. But he no longer believed in people. Not truly, and people sensed that. When the flood finally came, delayed and brief, it destroyed as much as it nourished. Temples were swept away, villages inundated, and amid the mud and debris, survivors asked a single question: where is the king? He was there, but they no longer felt him. Instead, they saw Chanthita. She was the one walking among them, barefoot in the silt, organizing shelter, redirecting food. She gave no speeches, but she was seen. And in kingdoms, being seen is the first step toward power. The court began murmuring. Perhaps she should guide the throne more directly. The Sangha began hinting, a regency of spirit, while the king contemplates the Dharma. She said nothing, but one night, she returned to the chamber where Lotai had first written the line, "Even Dharma can be corrupted." She stared at it for a long time. Then, with a single stroke of ink, she crossed out the word Dharma and replaced it with love. It began not with rebellion, but with hunger. The rains had been cruel and the sun pitiless. Across Sukhothai's southern plains, the rice shoots yellowed before they reached knee-height. Cattle grew thin, children thinner. Temples once vibrant with chants became silent with waiting. And in that silence, questions returned, old, sharp, and unforgiving. Where was the king? Why did he build libraries while granaries emptied? What good was a scroll to a starving child? Lotai had been warned. His advisors had murmured weeks earlier of shrinking harvests, slower barge shipments, price spikes in dried fish and salt. But he had been focused, perhaps too narrowly, on completing his commentary to Tre Phum. He believed the drought was not a punishment, but a test, karmic lesson. The land suffers when its people lose sight of truth. But the people did not want truth. They wanted rice, and that difference was fatal. The first village to riot was small Namthong, nestled near the border with Lana. A tax collector arrived demanding grain quotas. The villagers, desperate and humiliated, refused. When his guards tried to confiscate what remained, a stone was thrown, then a stick, then a fire. By nightfall, the tax office burned. Lotai received the report with measured calm. "Desperation breeds fire," he said, "not malice." He ordered relief wagons sent, not soldiers. But by the time they arrived, 3 more villages had followed Nam Thong's path. In Phichit, a grain store was looted by a crowd chanting old songs. Songs that praised kings of action, not of ink. In Sawankalak, a monk was beaten after refusing to sell temple grain. And in the city's eastern quarter, someone scrawled a chilling phrase in coal across a temple wall. "A king who speaks of heaven while we starve on earth. What realm does he rule?" In the palace, panic set in. Advisors begged Lotai to act. Generals requested permission to march. Even Chanthita, now more distant than ever, stood in the war council chamber and said simply, "The people do not fear your truth. They fear your absence." But he hesitated, because in his heart he saw a trap. To respond with force would betray everything Tre Phum taught: compassion, restraint, introspection. But to remain passive would risk collapse. He stood between Dharma and disaster, torn in half by the consequences of both. Then came the final blow. In a quiet town near the Khmer border, a group of young monks loyal to Lotai's teachings were found dead, drowned in the village well. No notes, no arrests, only the robe of the eldest, tied in a knot that resembled a serpent. The kingdom did not erupt, shifted. A fog settled over Sukhothai, not of weather but of disillusion. People no longer shouted. They murmured, no longer prayed aloud. They watched. The market stalls grew quieter. The temple bells rang less often. Something had broken, not in the structure of the state, but in its spirit. And Lotai felt it in his chest like a stone he could no longer lift. One night, sleepless and alone. He walked into the temple library he had built with such hope years earlier. The walls, once gleaming with knowledge, now felt like tombs of ideas no longer welcome. He sat before a statue of the Buddha and whispered, "Have I failed them, or have they failed me?" The statue gave no answer, only its eternal, unreadable smile. The next morning, Lotai did what no one expected. He ordered a public trial, not for the rebels, for himself. He invited the Sangha, the nobles, the governors, the foreign emissaries. In the central plaza of Sukhothai, beneath a banner that bore no emblem but the word karma, he stood alone, unarmed, and delivered a speech that would echo through history. He confessed that he had underestimated suffering, that he had believed knowledge could nourish the body, that he had placed too much faith in the scroll and too little in the soil. Then he paused and said, "But I will not abandon truth because the world grows impatient. I will not trade insight for obedience. I will not pretend that peace means silence." He did not ask forgiveness. He offered transparency. He pledged to redirect royal funds to grain distribution, to suspend tax collection in drought-struck regions, to hold monthly public councils where farmers and monks and mothers could speak directly to the crown. But he warned, "This is not weakness. It is awakening, and no kingdom survives asleep." The response was conflicted. Some wept, some turned away, some cheered. But beneath it all, the tide began to shift again. Temples reopened their stores. Grain prices dipped. The Sangha, split and weary, allowed the king's reforms to continue, cautiously. And Ban Muing, watching from afar, sent no message. That silence said everything, but not all rejoiced. Within the palace, a guard found a note beneath Lotai's meditation mat days later. It read, "You have placed the Dharma above your people. Now you will watch them burn it." And in the distance, smoke was rising again. Not from rebellion, from something worse, a faith that had begun to doubt itself. He returned as quietly as he had vanished. No fanfare, no trumpets, no soldiers in formation, just a single procession of modest carriages, bearing no banners but covered in the dust of long roads. Ban Muing entered the gates of Sukhothai not like a conqueror, but like a son come home, humble, unarmed, polite. But Lotai knew better. Shadows do not need swords, only timing. It had been years since the brothers had stood face to face. Their paths had diverged not with violence, but with silence. Two rivers parting at an unseen fork. Now, after drought, unrest, and a trial Lotai had staged for his own soul, Ban Muing returned not as a rival, but as a supporter. That was the word he used. "I only wish to offer my help," he said, standing in the courtyard of the palace where their father's ashes still whispered through the walls. "Our people need unity." Lotai looked at him and saw something familiar and foreign. The same eyes, but harder. The same voice, but smoother. And around his brother's neck, not a sword, not a scroll, but a necklace bearing a small medallion of the threefold flame, symbol of the Sangha Council. A reminder, Ban Muing had chosen a side. Still, Lotai received him. The court, weary from upheaval, welcomed the gesture. Nobles who had grown tired of Lotai's introspective rule saw in Ban Muing a return to balance. A man with administrative discipline, with allies, with the aura of strength that Lotai, for all his vision, could never quite embody. It began innocently. Ban Muing offered logistical help with grain routes. He repaired a key aqueduct near Phitsanulok using his own funds. He hosted a festival honoring the founder, Lotai, and their father, inviting monks from both traditionalist and reformist factions. His speeches were short, his gifts thoughtful, his gaze always just low enough to signal deference. But behind the curtain, the slow seduction of the court had begun. Ban Muing began to frequent the private libraries, reviewing scrolls. He met with scribes once loyal to Lotai. He attended Chantada's community councils, offering quiet suggestions that the queen found unexpectedly practical. One day, he stood at the outer edge of a children's debate session where young novices were reciting Trefum, and he asked a single question. If a king is both father and servant, which does the child obey? The children laughed, the scribes paused, and Chanthada, watching from a distance, felt something old stir, a memory of certainty. Lotai watched it all unfold. He did not confront. He observed. He hoped it was sincerity. But that hope faded when the boy arrived. The child was 9, sharp-eyed, confident, Ban Muing's only son. He was introduced formally to the court, not as heir, but as student of the realm. He was enrolled in the Royal Academy, trained in statecraft, and, most notably, assigned a tutor from the traditionalist Sangha faction. One who had publicly criticized Trefum. It was a move that required no explanation. Ban Muing was not coming for the crown. He was raising someone who would inherit it through sympathy, not succession. Chanthada noticed it before Lotai did. She began to speak of Ban Muing's discipline, his clarity, his connection to the people. She never said the words, but Lotai felt the shift in her breath, in her silences. A queen once tethered to his spirit was now gravitating toward stability, even if it wore the face of his brother. And in private, Lotai began to unravel. He stopped writing. He abandoned the next chapter of his commentary. He walked the palace grounds at night, barefoot, speaking to no one, his face gaunt with sleeplessness. He spent long hours kneeling in front of the statue of his father, not to pray, but to listen, as if the stone might speak, as if the founder might return and tell him what to do. But the stone remained silent, and the court grew louder. A noble council proposed a new advisory seat on the king's inner circle, granted to Ban Muing. A gesture of familial unity, they said, a voice of balance. Chanthada did not oppose it. Lotai approved it, with a smile that fooled no one. In his journal that night he wrote, "He does not seek my crown. He seeks to become the throne beneath it." Then came the feast, a celebration of the autumn harvest, better this year, after relief reforms. Ban Muing offered to sponsor it. It was lavish. Musicians, poets, glowing lanterns strung like constellations across the courtyard. He toasted to the king, to the queen, to the people, and then, carefully, to the future guardians of Sukhothai. That night, a servant found a letter hidden beneath Lotai's meditation cushion. Not written by his brother, by his son, a child of 12, quiet and watchful. The letter read, "Father, why does everyone bow deeper to uncle than to you? I still bow to you the deepest." Lotai wept, not out of sorrow, but because he no longer believed he deserved the bow. And in the quiet hours of that same night, he made a decision. One that would change everything. He summoned Ban Muing. Alone. No guards. No scribes. What passed between them in that chamber was never recorded. But the next morning, Ban Muing left the capital again. Not banished, not disgraced, but absent. And 3 days later, the tutor of his son was found dead. A fall from the tower. No foul play suspected. No suspects named. But everyone knew the war had turned inward. Lotai returned to his scrolls. But the ink now felt heavier, the words more distant. The crown, still his, sat upon a throne that no longer listened. And somewhere in the province beyond the river, Ban Muing was planting something. Not rebellion, legacy. It had stood for 37 years, high above the city, unrung, unshaken, untouched, the great bronze bell of Wat Phral Wang, forged during the final year of Si Inthrathit's reign. It had been hung atop the temple's spire with great ceremony but never struck, not once. Legend said it would sound only when Sukhothai faced its moment of greatest reckoning. Priests avoided its shadow. Pilgrims prayed beneath it with averted eyes. And for Lotai, it had always felt like a presence in the sky, watchful, silent, sacred, until the night it broke. No one heard the impact, only the aftermath. The bell, all 1,300 pounds of it, was found shattered in the courtyard below, split clean in two as though struck not by force, but by time itself. No witnesses, no storm, no earthquake, only silence, then ruin. At first, the monks whispered of age, of corrosion, of gravity's long patience. But the people saw something else, an omen. The next morning, pilgrims left flowers at the crack. Some left offerings, others left prayers, scrawled in charcoal on temple walls. Let the bell break, but not the king. We are the sound it never made. What does the silence mean, if it can shatter us? Sukhothai stood before the broken bronze with his son at his side. The boy asked no questions. He only stared. And the king, for the first time, had no answer. He ordered no investigation. He gave no public address. He returned to the palace and closed his chamber doors. But in the hall outside his study, the tension had already taken form, not in chaos, but in certainty. The nobles were coalescing again. The Sangha, long split, had found unity in necessity. Even the queen no longer shielded him. Chanthada had grown still, no longer advising, no longer dissenting. She moved through the palace with perfect poise, but her silence felt colder than any word. She did not challenge Sukhothai's solitude, but she no longer stepped into it with him. And then came the petitions. They arrived folded and inked with immaculate respect. Requests for decentralization, for more regional autonomy, for local assemblies to select their own temple councils. On the surface, these were gestures of reform, but beneath them lay a new architecture of disempowerment. The kingdom was voting the king out, one parchment at a time. Sukhothai knew what was happening, but he no longer fought. He spent his hours now in the old scriptorium, surrounded by copies of Tre Phum, many annotated, amended, even redacted. Monks from new provinces sent rewrites of his work, claiming cultural adaptation. Some added verses he never penned. Others omitted his most dangerous lines. One monk in Levo rewrote the entire section on royal karma, concluding, "A good king is not one who doubts, but one who obeys the cycle." Sukhothai read it in full, then burned it without ceremony. The final thread snapped one evening when a village delegation arrived at the palace gates. They brought no gifts, only requests. Their temple had been overrun by followers of a new doctrine, one that claimed Sukhothai's reforms had broken the sacred contract between ruler and divine. The leader, a boy no older than 20, held up a banner painted in ochre. On it was an image of the shattered bell, surrounded by flames. Below it, 3 words, "Let silence fall." The phrase spread within days. Merchants whispered it. Monks muttered it. Children scrawled it on stones. Let silence fall. What had once been Sukhothai's greatest weapon, reflection, contemplation, stillness, had now been turned against him. He became the ghost of his own kingdom. In council, he was politely ignored. In ceremony, he was observed like a statue. In the streets, his name no longer inspired bows, only stories. Some said he had lost his mind. Others claimed he had achieved enlightenment and no longer cared for earthly rule. A few still believed in him, but quietly, cautiously. Then, without announcement, he left the palace. Not to flee, to build. Alone, he walked to the outskirts of the capital, to a hill once marked for a royal stupa. There, with no fanfare, he began lifting stones. Monks followed. Then villagers. Not many, just enough. For weeks, he worked in silence, constructing a new temple, not in the image of tradition but of clarity. No throne, no banners, no idol larger than a man. At the center, he placed not a statue but a mirror. When asked why, he said, "To rule is to reflect. When the people stand before it, they must see themselves." It became known as Wat Kamaphon, the Temple of Echoed Deeds. But not everyone saw it as sacred. On the 43rd night of its construction, a fire broke out in the base structure. The monks fled. The villagers panicked. Sukhothai stood alone, watching as the mirror cracked, split down the center, and fell into ash. He did not weep. He did not speak. He simply sat, for hours, until dawn, and when the first light touched the hilltop, he whispered only one word: "Enough." The mirror was gone. The fire had done its work, and so had the years. Lotai returned to the palace not as a ruler, but as a remnant. His hands bore the soot of a ruined temple. His eyes, the haze of a man who had stared too long into the void where belief used to live. The halls that once echoed with sermons and scrolls now felt like mausoleums. Grand, silent, echoing only memory. He walked the marble corridors alone. No one stopped him, not because they feared him, but because they no longer knew who he was. And neither did he. What does a king become when the throne has moved on without him? What does wisdom mean when it no longer feeds the hungry? What does silence offer? Once it has been weaponized. That night, he entered the sanctum where the original trephum was kept, guarded, preserved, and untouched since its completion. The room was cold, the parchment yellowed, and on the floor, a mat waited. He knelt, brush in hand, and began the final chapter. Not an addendum, not a correction, a reckoning. He called it the Sutra of the Hollow Flame. It began without a blessing, no invocation, no metaphor, just a single line. The Dharma does not protect the king. It only asks that he stand still as it burns through him. And then he wrote, not like a ruler, like a man drowning with grace. He spoke of the temptation to mistake patience for wisdom, the guilt of building temples while children eat ash, the burden of watching a brother become a future he could not stop. He wrote of Chanthada not as a queen but as the final mirror. Her silence had never been betrayal. It had been the absence of belief, a void he had carved by loving her as an extension of his purpose, rather than a partner in his pain. And finally, he wrote of the bell, the one that had never rung, the one that had shattered, and how, in truth, he had dreamed of striking it himself, because he had always feared that its silence did not guard the kingdom. It reflected it. When he finished, he sealed the sutra with wax, wrapped it in plain cloth, and placed it beneath the statue of his father, where no scholar would find it, only someone looking for memory, not history. The next morning, he summoned his son. The boy was older now, 15, quiet, too watchful for his age. He had seen kingdoms rise and fall not through war, but through erosion. He bowed to his father not out of habit, but out of mourning. Lotai looked at him for a long time before speaking, and when he did, he said nothing of crowns, of duty, of lineage. Only this: rule only if you must, and if you must, do it with a hand that can be empty and still offer. The boy said nothing, but he nodded. 3 days later, a gathering was held at Wat Mahathat, a grand convocation of monks, nobles, regional leaders. The pretext: a festival to commemorate the king's birth. But Lotai did not arrive. Instead, a parchment was read aloud to the assembly, a royal decree, his last. I no longer seek to rule by ink, voice, or silence. I leave no heir, no command, no epilogue. Only a question: if wisdom cannot govern a kingdom, then who or what should? And with that, he was gone. No funeral was held, no body recovered, no successor declared for weeks. Some say he retreated into the forest. Others claim he walked into the river beneath the temple and disappeared beneath the current. A few believe he simply sat down one night beneath a Bodhi tree and stopped moving. But all agreed on this: the flame that was Lotai did not extinguish. It hollowed, then echoed, then became part of the air itself. And the people, for years after, would still pause in temples when the wind rustled through the eaves, as if listening for a voice that once ruled without shouting. The throne remained untouched for 49 days. In the absence of Lotai, the palace became a museum of pauses. Courtiers still arrived, but no orders were issued. Scrolls still arrived, but no seal was pressed. Meals were served at dawn and dusk in the king's chamber, and taken away untouched. The scent of incense filled the halls, not from worship, but from waiting. and the people waited, not for another ruler, for a sign. But Lotai never returned, not as a monk, not as a hermit, not as a spirit in fire or water or wind. He simply disappeared. And in that disappearance, something remarkable happened. The kingdom did not collapse. Instead, it breathed. The reforms he planted, once radical, once reviled, now took root in quiet corners. Children continued learning in Thai. Monks in far-flung provinces debated Tre Phum openly. Farmers in the Central Plains, once disillusioned, began forming self-governing councils around temples, quoting lines from the king's own sutras. Compassion is not hierarchy. A ruler must listen until he forgets the sound of his own voice. The nobles, for all their scheming, found that no one wanted another power struggle. The Sangha, fractured though it had been, slowly reconvened, not to restore control, but to preserve the uneasy truce Lotai had forged between faith and governance. And Chanthita? She remained in the palace, not as queen, as steward. She spoke rarely, issued only what was necessary, but her presence alone anchored the realm. She never claimed power. She never wore the crown. Yet when disputes arose, people still asked, what would she say? What she said, if anything, was only this: he ruled without ruling. Now he teaches without speaking. The boy, Lotai's son, grew in silence, and when the court finally moved to name him king, he declined the coronation. Let the people choose, he said, not for the sake of tradition, but for the sake of trust. He too had learned. But it was not his voice that carried Lotai's legacy forward. It was the bell, the broken bell of Wat Phra Luang. Months after the king's disappearance, a group of villagers attempted to remove its cracked halves from the courtyard. They planned to melt it down, perhaps into a statue, perhaps into tools. But when the metal was struck, something unexpected happened. It rang, not clearly, not brightly, but deep, raw, resonant. A vibration that didn't echo but lingered. The villagers stopped, listened, and left the bell where it lay. From that day onward, it was struck once a year, on the anniversary of Lotai's final decree. Not as a memorial, as a question, because in the end that was what he had become. Not a ruler, not a sage, not a martyr, a question. And questions, unlike crowns, are never buried. They live in the hands of those who dare ask. Can you govern without grasping? Can you lead without legacy? Can you disappear and still be heard? Somewhere, far beyond the capital, in a forest where Bodhi trees bend toward quiet, a worn mat lies beneath fallen leaves, and beside it, a single line carved into stone. To rule the world is to know when to vanish from it. That was Lotai's kingdom, and that, perhaps, was his true throne.